that the paranormal is real. Listen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Curious Explorers. I'm Traci Stein. My co-host, Kathy Kelly, is off in Transylvania again. So hopefully she'll have some great stories for us when she returns. But you're going to be so excited because my guest today is the author of The Rabbit Hole Experience, the co-author on Sasquatches, spirits, and the people who see them, Michael Robartes. Michael, so good to see you.
Thanks for having me on, Traci. Good to be here.
Well, I'm going to do a little brief bio, but then you will fill in the blanks because obviously you know your story way better than I do. But Michael Robartes is a paranormal investigator, and he's an international man of mystery. As you can see, we don't want to blow his cover. Michael has led Scientific Paranormal, which is an investigation team in the Atlantic Paranormal Society, or the TAPS family network. You've seen them on TV. They're well-trained. You've got a ghost or some other paranormal issue, and that's who you call. So Michael considers paranormal investigation to be as much about helping people to integrate their experiences, which we often have a hard time doing, actually. It's as much about that as it is about trying to explain the phenomena themselves. So without further ado, Michael, welcome again. I know you're busy doing all things paranormal. So I so appreciate
and some normal.
A living person who's able to catch your attention for a little bit.
I'm excited too, because you're the first psychologist we've actually talked to about the book.
Really?
And we were a little concerned about it because, we do we get into some psychology type stuff in the book, and we wanted to be very careful about not claiming that we're psychologists.
I didn't experience you as coming across that way. And I actually thought it was really, maybe we should start there because, you talk in the book, you're not trying to prove or disprove the experiences that people report. And you talk about everything from Bigfoot or Sasquatch to ghosts and spirits. And there's a distinction. We'll talk about that. But you're really more interested in the experience. So you're taking a psychologically minded approach, which is to me very unique.
Yeah, we wanted to do something a little different. Not just, there are stories in there from investigations and things, but we are using them more to think about the client's experiences and what they actually went through. And that was the way it came about because Paul and I were comparing stories. He's on the Bigfoot side, and I was more on the ghost side. And we kind of started to see that, the people that we were dealing with had similar experiences. And we got talking about that and wanted to bring that to people's attention because I think, there's so many books just about telling spooky stories, but the clients don't get enough attention, I think.
It's so funny because until you mentioned that, until I read that in your book, it hadn't even really occurred to me. Kathy and I talk about these things sometimes. And, I know you listened to a recent episode where we talked about a well-known-ish case that Father Malachi Martin had written about where, clearly there was so much going on there psychologically, probably for the whole family and everybody who knew this person, but also in the person that supposedly was demonically possessed. And that's actually more extreme than most of the cases you'll probably talk about. But there is a psychological component, and you can't have these experiences without being affected.
Yeah, really over the years, it seems like it's pretty rare that they're not combined. We go, to investigate the paranormal part, but once you get there, you realize, there's all kinds of other stuff going on here that also needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. It's so funny because I have about 1,000 questions for you. I don't know if you can see the thought balloons above my head. Perhaps you can. But, part of me wants to jump into a particular case you mentioned in the book. Maybe we'll do that. But then I also want to get into your story because I'm sure it's just as compelling. So the story of Angela, a woman in her late 60s who's recently widowed and then starts having a whole host, like a range of, I'm going to say very, I don't know if it's discrepant, divergent, it's some sort of different phenomena happening. And it almost defies reason. I mean, it sounds like it's well beyond what you would normally encounter. And I'm wondering if you would want to talk about that case.
Well, the main thing that struck me about that one was just the impact it had on her. I mean, this woman was out sleeping in her car at night because she didn't want to be in the house. As you said, she was probably late 60s at the time and would stay in her house all day. And then when night came and it was time to go to bed, she would go out and get in her car and drive somewhere and find a place to park and turn the heat on and sleep in the car. And that's that's the point she was at in dealing with the phenomena. And we went in and checked it out. She was interpreting it in her framework too. She was very religious, and we went down into her basement and she had rosaries like hanging, I mean, every 5 feet in the rafters of the basement.
Can you describe what she experienced?
Well, it was a combination of things. Some of it was negative, like she experienced, some of it was standard stuff, footsteps, hearing footsteps, voices. Some of it was more negative, like when she would sleep in a chair, kind of a recliner chair, because, it helped her breathe better, whatever. And she reported like feeling like she was being choked a couple of times, that kind of thing. But then there were other experiences that were almost angelic. Like she described these beings coming out of the wall of her apartment that were like light beings dancing around. And it was just like a whole host of things. And when we went in, we did find some things. We could corroborate that there seemed to be something going on. I don't know whether it was negative or positive or what, but I don't think she was totally imagining it.
And forgive me, because this is where the psychologist in me feels like I need to almost express what's going through my mind. Because as I was reading your book, I was struck by, this is a woman who is in her late 60s. She's been married presumably for a lot of her life. Her husband's recently passed away. So she's dealing with grief. She's dealing with the understandable anxiety that a lot of people have when they're all of a sudden living alone and they haven't done that, maybe ever. I don't know her backstory. But she described, like you said, things that felt physical. She had multiple sensory experiences, things touching her, including feeling like she was being sexually assaulted, which between that and the choking, the terror, I can't even fathom. And other experiences that seem, like you said, kind of, I hate to say run of the mill because we don't want to minimize them. Those would be scary enough for some people, most people, right? The footsteps alone. But then she's having visual phenomena, auditory phenomena. Some feels angelic or comforting. But she's so, forgive the term, but understandably destabilized by this experience, to the point that, like you said, she's no longer sleeping. She sold her first house, right? And then moved to this townhouse?
She did, yeah, as I recall.
And the phenomena followed her?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. It's been a while since I've thought about it, but
no, that's what, I read it more recently, and,
right.
It sounds like it did. You describe in the book how it's not only that she's sleeping in her car with the heat on, as somebody who lived in central New York for 4.5 years, it is the coldest place on earth, or it feels like it. Like, even with the heat on, I can't, you'd have to be so frightened to do that. It sounds like her life was destroyed by this.
And these are the kinds of people we wanted to help, because like, who is she going to call? The police? You know, they're not going to help her. Probably lock her up someplace. But, you know, we went in, and we did end up, like, we showed her that we didn't think she was crazy, which I think that always helps, just to say, like, yeah, I think, you know, there is something going on. But we also had to carefully sort of tell her, you should probably get some counseling for these other issues as well, you know. Let's address it from both sides. And we told her, if we'll be around, you can call us anytime. But let's work on both and see if we can get to a happier place.
I love that you both were so aware and so sensitive to the fact that this could be paranormal, this could be environmental, which it doesn't sound like it is. It could be psychological, and that it can be both, that they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
You know, Kathy and I have talked about this, and, you know, like, again, I'm thinking, like, when you're in such a heightened and distressed state, I don't know that that doesn't make you more vulnerable, both
No,
to,
I think that's true. Yeah.
you know, a break with reality maybe, but also to, you know, some sort of otherworldly attack. So I thought it was so thoughtful that you guys addressed that head on. You didn't just, you know, you didn't feel like you had to put it in one basket.
No, and she has had other groups come in there too before us. And as we've heard a lot from people, she said they came in, wandered around for a bit, and then left, and she never heard from them again. You know, just, I don't know, having a fun Friday night trying to get a scare or something. I don't know. But I don't see what the point of that is if you're not going to actually try to help the person. But
Yeah,
you're right about I totally agree with that. Like, the events themselves can cause your distressed state. But at the same time, I think somebody in a distressed state anyway is vulnerable, especially to more like negative type entities that will come in and want to take advantage of that.
it's interesting. I hope this is an okay kind of like tangent here. You know, I'm thinking back to my own training, and, you know, a lot of mental health professionals think this is always BS. You know, they'll come up with 1,000 plausible reasons why it cannot be anything but that the person is, you know, either making this up or breaking with reality, which I find unhelpful. But, you know, there are others who will similarly say, I'm not sure what it is, but that, you know, some more kind of, I'm going to just say people with more serious mental health problems, like, again, where you're crossing out of the normal reality, the normal consensus reality in a way that is not necessarily healthy, can have uncanny kind of psychic or telepathic, I don't know if I want to call it awareness, or moments that, you know, if somebody can't explain, they just say, well, I can't explain it, and they move on. But it's not something that no one observes,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, it always reminds me of that scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Terry Garr, right? Well, she says, it's just one of those things. After he sees the UFOs, he's like, one of what things? Well, you know, it's just one of those things that happens.
It just happens.
Yeah.
Does it? I don't know. I'm jumping around a little bit, but when I was reading your book, and you were talking about cognitive dissonance, which you talk about early on, and how, you know, people have these ideas about the world and how it works and what's real and what's not. Then they have a rabbit hole experience, which you can explain more why you came up with that term. I thought it was really clever. But now it's creating this distress that they have to resolve, right? So either now I have to change my understanding of reality in my world, or I have to I have to do mental gymnastics to deny what I've just experienced. And assuming you've heard of Michael Shermer, who's like a well-known skeptic. He prides himself on that, but I don't think he's a skeptic in the truest sense of the word. I think he's in the
Capital S,
religious,
skeptic.
you
Yeah.
know, he's devout. He's a devout skeptic. But I don't know if had you ever heard of his paranormal experience that he
No.
supposedly had. It's actually even on his website, but I had heard it years ago. And to make a long story short, he was getting remarried in 2014 to a woman from Germany, but I guess they were getting married in the United States. So she was far from home. Probably that was emotional as well. And her grandfather had just passed away. And so they had been going through his things. And one of them they came across was this 1978 transistor radio. And he tried everything to fix it. Nothing worked. So he like shoved it in the back of a drawer. So I guess they must have gotten married at their home or throughout the day. This completely non-working radio is playing like romantic and soothing music. And not only does the bride hear this, but Michael Shermer hears it. They pick up the radio, they bring it to other people so they can hear it. It plays all day or most throughout the day. And then it never plays again. And he acknowledges that he can't find a rational explanation for it and like wants to quote be open. But I think that was probably a very narrow window for him. I don't know. How do you think, how, in your experience, how do most people handle that when they're confronted with something paranormal?
Well, the whole variety of ways. That's what we kind of go through. What we try to do in the book is use case stories that we've had to illustrate different reactions that people have had to their experiences, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Probably the most common one is just straight denial. Just, it never happened. And it's amazing what people can deny, especially once they're removed from the situation. Even we had one of our team members, the story that's in the book about the 4 apartments where we heard the little girl's voice and such.
Can you talk about that? Can you retell that example? Because I think it's a great one.
Well, it's an apartment building, 2 apartments on the bottom, 2 in the upper floor. And we were originally called in because a woman who lived in the bottom floor, her son said that there was this little girl that would come and play with him at night, jump up and down on his bed and not let him sleep and such. So his mother called us and we came in. And, we get a lot of these types of calls, especially with kids, especially around the age of 3 for some reason. Around that time, I don't know if they're super sensitive at that time or what happens. Plus, they're also liking to tell stories at that time, too, which makes it difficult. So we went in, treating it as a normal case, started setting up our equipment, and we didn't even have our equipment set up. I could hear this little girl's voice, and we started walking around, couldn't figure out where it was coming from, thought it was outside, we checked everything. But we went back there several times, and the key one was we went back one night and we managed to get all of the residents of the building, except for there was one couple down on the bottom that kind of this older couple that didn't want anything to do with us for some reason. I don't know. Can't explain it.
Why they wouldn't want ghost hunters
why
traipsing
would they
through their
not want
apartment?
these people running wires and cameras all over everything? So they kind of ignored us. But everybody else in the building left so that we could have the whole building. And we spent the night in the building and slept in the apartment upstairs. And you could just hear this little girl all night long. We have it on the recorders. You could track it like it would be in one room on a recorder, and then it would stop and it would start in another room. It was crazy. But one of our team members that was on that case, it was like, I can't remember if it was her first investigation or at least one of the first. And we had her sleeping overnight in this house, and she had quite the experience. But even that, like going back to what we were talking about, like talked to her a couple weeks later and she was already questioning, like, well, maybe it was something else. Maybe I didn't really hear it, you know? And once you're removed from the situation, it's just really easy to just talk yourself into the fact that it's something else. And I think that's where evidence does come in. A lot of the book we spent talking about, like, no evidence can ever convince anybody of this stuff. But I think where it does come in is if you were actually there and you have evidence so that when you get into that state of starting to deny it, you can go back and listen to it again and go, oh, that actually happened. I think that might be the value of it.
Yeah, it's so true. And, it's something that even Kathy and I were talking about this recently, like, exactly as you said, if somebody's not going to be convinced, they're not going to be convinced, and it wouldn't matter what you offered.
Right.
But the person's felt experience is the most impactful thing. It's like you said, the recorded evidence is something to make you remember, though I didn't just imagine this, because we kind of want to think that a lot of the time, but there is almost nothing more powerful than being there yourself.
Right.
I'm wondering if it's okay for me, and you can not answer anything I ask because I know these experiences are personal, but I'm wondering about what made you decide to do this work, to get into paranormal investigating, to write this book.
Well, writing the book was because that was crazy. But I had my own experiences through childhood, just off and on, lots of stuff going on. It eventually culminated in 2009. I got into what I guess at the time I probably would have called a demonic infestation, oppression type situation.
Oh my God.
I'd probably be more cautious with terms nowadays, but at the time, I mean, as far as the symptoms were there, the symptoms were basically what you would think of. It took me most of a year to get out of it. And after I did, I was exhausted, but I also felt like I kind of realized there are people who are dealing with this sort of thing and they don't have anybody to talk to, like Angela in our car. And so that was when I started looking around thinking that I wanted to somehow be able to help these people. And just so happens that January of 2010, I happened to meet up with the TAPS team from the TV show. And they were setting up this network of teams to take cases for them because everybody was calling them at the time because of the show. And so I joined up with a team that was working out of Syracuse. And eventually, when our manager moved, I took over the team, and that was the story.
Wow. I mean,
we lived happily ever after.
You know what it is? I'm sitting here and I'm a bit transfixed for a variety of reasons. Among them, what you're not saying is as compelling as what you are sharing. And I'm just going to leave it at that because I can imagine. I feel like sometimes these conversations are almost like a little bit of a Rorschach because we have our own stuff that just gets projected right in there like, holy cow,
Sure.
But no, I mean, that's very impactful. And it sounds like it was really fortuitous, or maybe, I don't know if there's another word you would use to describe, but running into the TAPS people.
Yeah. And it made a big impact on me because I had felt so alone for that whole time. And then to just be hanging out with people who were sort of accepted that this was all real and we deal with this. But it was kind of like, yes, it's all real, but we can still have a good time, hang out and stuff. And that's what people need. And a lot of times that's what we would try to bring into people's houses when we went in. We take them seriously. We take the person seriously, but we don't treat the situation necessarily that seriously because we want them to know, like, this isn't something you need to be afraid of. Now, if you come in and you're acting, if the investigators are acting terrified, that's not going to help the people when you leave at the end of the night.
One of the things speaking of the investigators, one of the things you describe in the book is your team. What a unique team. And that one member of your team is a woman who is a Wiccan, who also is a police officer. And I forget what else, but what an interesting combination.
Yeah.
And what a unique skill set to have on these investigations.
Yeah, we actually had a really good group. For the most part, we've moved. I've moved away from that area, and most of the team has too. But we had a really great group that we filled in for each other's weaknesses. My weakness probably being like, I'm more of the logical person. Like, I'm not the most compassionate person on the planet. So when one of the clients was having a really hard time, like, wasn't my sort of thing. So maybe somebody else would come in. We had Todd, who was a paramedic, and Pat was also amazing with clients. The one time I saw him just with this old woman that we were in her house, and she was breaking down crying, and he just like took her hand and sat there and talked with her. Very impressive to me.
It's interesting as you're describing the different people on the team, including yourself. What I'm imagining, though, is your own kind of very logical, less maybe emotionally effusive. If I get it wrong, you tell me. But style.
I think that would be considered fair. Yeah.
Then maybe that too, though, is reassuring in a different way, because like you said, every member of the team is kind of, I'm just thinking, I use this analogy all the time, but like spokes on the wheel.
Yep.
Right. And each one is important to the integrity of the wheel. And the logical person can be a calming presence simply by not being maybe as attuned, because it can be a very vulnerable place to be as well when you are so attuned, when you are super empathic.
Right.
Just speaking as somebody who's kind of spongy, so it's nice to have that balance. I have a whole bunch of questions for you. I'm curious, having done the work, the paranormal investigating, and thinking about this in the way you have, what's changed for you since doing this? Or, and maybe nothing has, but I'm wondering if your perspective or something else has changed.
Well, part of what changed is what led to the book. Just dealing with the people and seeing like all the various ways that it impacts people and how different they are. I guess I would have expected like people have experiences and it's scary to them in general, but there's such a wide variety of reactions and ways that these leads people on to further things. Sometimes people just move on and accept this as part of life, and maybe it makes life a little richer or something, but they go back to their daily lives. Some become totally obsessed and can't do anything else ever again except wander around the woods at night or whatever it might be. So that part is kind of different. as far as like my perspective on how the world works or whatever, I don't think, I wouldn't say it's changed because it's always changing. So yes, it's continued that process, but I don't know if there was a dramatic shift.
Okay.
I had kind of already had my rabbit hole experiences, various ones before going into this work. So nothing I saw in our work. I mean, we saw some new things that I had never thought of, but nothing like that altered my worldview at that point or anything.
I wonder if I could ask you a question. Because I'm, speaking of your worldview and how you would describe yourself in this world. And again, correct me if I get it wrong, but I listened to a few of your other interviews. And am I correct in taking that you've said that you don't consider yourself to be a super psychic person?
That's true. Yeah.
Here's a question I have, because I don't know what I think. I think I've always assumed that if people can pick up on paranormal phenomena, because not everybody does. I mean, everybody knows somebody who's kind of like a rock. Like you could probably put them in the most haunted place and they would sleep like a baby. And other people who can like pick up something almost anywhere. And there's probably this whole continuum. But do you have to have psychic ability to perceive these things, right? Like, I'm curious about your take on that.
That would be a hard question because I think I would think that everyone has some psychic ability. I mean, we're both remote viewers. We can say that, can't we?
Yeah, I know. It's so funny. I was trying to avoid that, but I'm glad you brought up because now I want to delve into it.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. And, from the perspective, like, we're all psychic, we can do that, but like, I need the structure and the method, I think, to be able to do it. I'm not the type that, like, when we went into some supposedly haunted location that everybody was feeling creeped out and everything, I would be like, I don't know, pretty comfortable. But I don't know if I'm not feeling it or if it just doesn't bother me. No. But it is true that, like, even in the most haunted location, it depends on who's there. One family might move into the Amityville house and live for 10 years and nothing happens. And then somebody else comes in and, the walls are bleeding. So is it the person? I think it's probably the person, but is it their innate ability? Is it their emotional state? Who knows?
I think there probably is something interactive. And, it's funny because I feel like the best paranormal movies are the ones that are kind of psychological thrillers and really just you can imagine the reason for whatever is there doing what it does the way it does, right? I mean, it's kind of like, like evil spirits gaslighting a person and making everybody else be even less supportive, like it to me, It seems like if it's an intelligent haunting or worse, there is some interactive kind of element. And I don't know enough to really describe it better.
Yeah. And isolation is like one of the main techniques. Like they'll do anything they can to make the person avoid their friends and everything else and isolate them, because once they're isolated, then they're vulnerable.
Oh yeah. That's like awful. You did mention that we know each other through the remote viewing kind of community, which I'm finding is much larger. It's like quiet on some fronts and not so quiet on other fronts. There's a lot more people who do this than I think most people realize. But when we were at a conference recently, somebody else that I know only from the training, I'm bringing this up because it relates to something you mentioned in the book, you and Paul mentioned in the book. but approached me about aliens and talk about resolving cognitive dissonance with denial. I was like, listen, I'm not saying it's not real, but I don't want to talk about it. And I really don't want to and the more you're explaining to me that I'm not thinking I now want to talk about it more.
Right.
And it wasn't to be awful. It's more that it's like that I've compartmentalized that and put it on a shelf that's a lot farther away. The ghost stuff, even though it can be scary, is familiar. And I've been there, done that. And it's a whole different thing. I feel equipped mentally to deal with that in a different way. You and Paul mention in your book how interesting it is that people can be like, oh yeah, Bigfoot's real, but the ghost thing I don't get, and vice versa.
Yeah.
That I found so interesting
Yeah.
because it's true.
And even Paul, I think we mentioned right at the beginning of the book, when he met me, he really didn't want anything to do with the ghost stuff. He wants to go out in the woods and hunt monsters, but the ghost stuff can just stay over there,
That'd be a tough choice, right? I'm going to be in this haunted house, which might feel terrible, or I've got to be in the woods with something I'm pretty sure I can outrun. I don't know. How do you pick?
Yeah, I don't know. I think he would tell you that his dream way to go is he just wants to get eaten by a bear, and that would be the best way to go. So for him, that would probably
we're not
be okay.
on the same page. That's the first time I've ever heard that. N of one. I don't think there's a lot of people in that group. I could be wrong. So interesting. Here's a question for you. What percentage of cases that you have explored do you think turn out to have some non-paranormal explanation where you're like, you know what? I believe that you believe this. I'm trying to help alleviate your fear and suffering. And I think there's a completely non-paranormal explanation.
Tough one. Let me flip the question. I'll answer it this way. The vast majority of investigations we do or did, we didn't find very much.
Ah.
That doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing going on.
Agreed.
So, and we were always well aware of that. We're going on in there for a limited time. It's probably, even in the most haunted place, you have a low chance of finding anything anyway. So when we walk out, I wouldn't necessarily say I think it wasn't paranormal. So it's a little hard to say what percentage was I label as non-paranormal. I don't know. The majority, probably.
Okay.
But I don't know how big a majority.
I mean, that's fair.
And then, it'll be maybe 25% of cases you'd find some sort of evidence. And then if you asked, how many did we investigate, that I would 100% say, oh yeah, absolutely, this place was crazy. Maybe a handful.
Okay.
And I teach statistics, so I know I can't say anything for sure 100%, but as close as I can get to that.
Okay. I'm very impressed that you teach statistics, by the way. That actually, for many people, statistics is more scary than ghosts for many people.
What about UFOs?
Statistics, yeah, UFOs, Sasquatch, and ghosts. It'd be like a tough call. You write in the book about that you guys don't disagree, believe that there happen to be entities that do want to cause harm or distress to people. You talk about ghosts, which are probably residual, probably not doing much, but frightening you because you don't, nobody's used to paranormal experiences like that, or most people. spirits that are probably intelligent and somewhat interactive. And then other stuff probably isn't human, has a different intention. Do you want to talk about that or not?
Probably not a lot.
And we don't
I'll-
have to.
I'll just say this. I mentioned earlier when you were talking about my history, that I would probably be more careful about using terms like demon now than maybe in the past. These days, I think a lot of what people attribute to demonic activity is probably what I would just call like negative entities, parasitic or, some sort of low level being. We're not talking about fallen angels or anything like that. However, on a few occasions, I have encountered something else that was a higher level. And I don't know how to describe it other than in the presence of these things, you just feel a primal sense of fear. And I don't know, for some reason, it always seems to be like on the outskirts of things, like they're on the outskirts. I don't know, directing the activity or maybe just feeding on the prey, like a lion, letting the hyenas take a zebra down and then coming in and taking over. I don't know what it is, but on the few occasions that I have come across these entities, I don't know how you would describe it other than just pure evil. I mean, that was the feeling.
Thank you for sharing that, because I can see that it's not easy to talk about. Understatement. I'm debating whether I should share a personal experience. I don't want to make you uncomfortable with, or anybody listening. The summary statement is that, this has got to be like, I'm going to say it could be more than 10 years ago. I went to that might be like 15 plus years ago, at least. But I went to a 3-day weekend kind of psychic thing with somebody who's now a well-known medium and a wonderful person. And it was mostly psychic practice. And at the end of on the last day, this person singled me out and one other person to do mediumship. And I'm not a professional medium. I've had mediumistic experiences on and off for, throughout my life. But, the readings were great. I feel like there's a group effect. It's much easier, I think, to be spontaneously psychic sometimes in these settings. For whatever reason, the energy is different. And now I'm driving 4 hours home by myself, feeling okay. But I think a lot of the people feel a little tired after these kind of weekends. So now I'm home. And throughout the week, I'm having a series of uncomfortable and lingering experiences. And I'm not nervous. I've left the weekend behind me. I'm back. I think I was a PhD student at the time. So it was a while ago. And I experienced several things, at least one I would say was an attachment. I had an awareness of something. I could see this person in my mind's eye. I could feel emotions that almost felt like mine, but weren't. I had food cravings I'd never had. And my fatigue worsened to the point over the course of this week that I was barely functional. And then one day I went to lie down on my bed in like the middle of the day. I was, I had a weird schedule because I was a student, and sometimes what happens, not often anymore, but I'll close my eyes and have this kind of astral vision around the room where, my eyes are closed. People who've had the experience know what I'm talking about, but people who haven't had it just think it sounds wacky. But so I am kind of astrally looking around my room. I'm trying to sleep. I'm so fatigued, but I can't. And I notice on the side of the bed, at this point, I don't know if my eyes were open or not. It's midday. And I see this little boy. And this little boy is like maybe 6 or 7 years old. And I can still see him pretty clearly in my mind's eye because he was very clear, cute little boy. I could tell you what his hair looked like and his eyes, his clothes. I'm getting actually nervous as I'm telling you. And I relayed this story to some people at like a few weeks ago who had never had these experiences. And I couldn't even really articulate this experience well. But you know it if you've had it. Because when I looked at this little boy, again, like maybe 5 feet from me on the other side of the bed, I knew it wasn't really a little boy. And I knew that it wasn't human. And it had a horrendous feeling. And it was so unsettling. This was a very protracted, very clear visual and otherwise, just multi-sensory experience of this thing that looked like a boy. So I wound up calling an energy healer that I know who's very good. And I just said, listen, I'm so depleted. I am barely functional. Like now I'm like walking around Manhattan with my cell phone and she's like, listen, let me work on you. And she's working on me at a distance, which you can do while I'm on the phone with her. And she's like, what the hell were you doing? She's like, I've got an old woman who is attached to you, a depressed old woman who's like feeding off of you. And that is exactly what I had been seeing and feeling throughout the week, separate from the little boy. And, like she did a lot of clearing. And I actually did feel better. I don't really care if anybody thinks it's just psychological or not, air quotes. She was like, you can't just go do these weekends. You're too open. And you're too spongy. And like, this is like taking your energy. Anyway, world's most long-winded anecdote. But when I've tried to explain to the few people I've told about it, they're like, well, what do you think it was? I'm like, I don't really know. And they're like, was it a demon? I'm like, I don't even want to call it that, but it was not human. And they're like, how do you know? And I can't describe it, but you feel it and you feel that its intentions are like, I hate to use the word malevolent, but this might be like 20 years ago now by this point, and I still remember this, and I hope it never happens again.
Yeah. Well,
and I know that there will be people who are like, I'm unsubscribing from this show. This is a bridge too far.
Hey, you tuned in for the Halloween episode.
Really? I have my skull shirt on. Nobody can see it, but it's like
nice
for Halloween. But you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I can imagine going to a gathering like that where everybody's so open that could be feeding ground for some entities that want to come in, I would think, and attach to somebody. But yeah, I know what you're talking about with the little boy. It's always a sign to me, like when I hear someone who was an investigator or something talking and they mentioned this kind of thing, this kind of experience, and I always know like that's somebody who actually has been out there and knows what they're talking about. These guys that on TV that run around and yell and scream and say, come and get me, demons, like you wouldn't be doing that if you actually knew what was out there.
That actually ties into my next question for you, which is, are there things you would say that you would advise people not to do, given what you've experienced? Provoking demons and saying, come and get me. We're going to put that on the list.
Don't do anything I do. No. All the stuff that people do, the Ouija boards and all of those things, whenever I hear people are doing them, I think, I don't know. I wouldn't. And somebody asked me one time, because, we would go into places and take recorders and do EVP sessions, stuff like that. And they would say, well, isn't that the same thing? Like, you're just trying to communicate. I think the difference is you're not asking something to take over your body to move something. This whole idea of like, come and take control of my body and move stuff, that's just a terrible idea. So, 99% of the time, students doing it drunk, probably nothing's going to happen. But I don't know. We've gone to an awful lot of cases where when we asked how it started, they'd say, oh, we were just screwing around with a Ouija board. Oh, okay. Or, people just playing around and doing rituals and all that sort of thing. And I'm not against that. Like, those things can be done as tech, but I'm also a little more cautious probably than some.
Oh, it makes sense. It's funny, you're talking about having a few drinks or whatever while doing the Ouija board. And, I'm one of these people that I feel like don't use a substance. Like I tell people, even if you're just doing psychic practice generally, don't have a drink and try to read somebody. Not that you can't do it. You actually can. And some people can do it better, because I think everything's just more porous to me. Like, I just feel like the boundaries between people are a little more wispy, like energetically, when, you're opened up, you're expansive. But, it's amazing how many people will like get high or have a few drinks and, use the Ouija board or something like that. And I think it's such a bad idea.
Yeah. And I always, especially when we're doing investigations and stuff like that, like, you want to have your rational mind there too, to be able to make sense of things. So you can't get rid of that completely.
No. Yeah. I'm going to tell you another anecdote. So when I was in college, shocker, a lot of people on my dorm floor were doing the Ouija board, and I didn't, but I was in the room sometimes. And then, the following year, I remember, living in a campus apartment. So like everybody for some reason thinks they're so much more mature because now they're not in a dorm, but so nothing can touch them. But anyway, people doing the Ouija board, and the year before, my grandfather had passed away, and this was devastating. I was extremely close to him, but when I was in college, it was pre-internet, just so everybody knows, vintage. And there would have been no way to look this up. I don't even think you could look up my grandfather's, death date now. And I remember, people saying, oh, come do it. I'm like, no, but like, they're like, well, ask a question. And I'm like, all right, when is the anniversary of my grandfather's passing? And this is the first person to go. And out of the grandparents. And I had it in my mind for some reason that it was December 29th. Maybe this is even like 2 years later. I don't even remember, but they came up with December 30th. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's wrong. And meanwhile, it's like it would have been when nobody was even at school. And it's not like I would have called people to tell them then, which I would have had to do because we didn't have email then. And lo and behold, I asked my mother, and it's like, well, the Ouija board was right. I was wrong. I wasn't even on it. And like, it spells out December 30th. And that actually was the anniversary of his death. And I just thought, like, all right, that's really creepy. There's other stuff that was really creepy, but I was thinking like, and I remember when, my roommates and I rented a house off campus the following year, pretty Victorian. This could have been like some low budget movie, but to make a long story short, the people upstairs and my roommates are doing the Ouija board. Now I didn't do it with them, but everybody goes home because it's like people were there for like first summer session and then left, and I'm still there. And this is in central New York. I'm 4 hours away from home. And a friend and I are hanging out one night, and I've said this before in the podcast, but literally completely awake and watching something, it's kind of like a railroad type of house, and watching this very tall, to me, it looked like a masculine silhouette, but it's solid black. And even as it walks in front of the windows, there are like street lights outside. So lights coming through the windows, this thing blocked the light. And like, I actually think that maybe they kind of invited something in, and I don't think it was human. So I think I'm not telling anybody to do the Ouija board or not, but it's always interesting to see people's takes on it, because I think it does let something in.
Like it can, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like picking up the phone, just dialing a random number and inviting the person.
You wouldn't do that.
Yeah, probably most of the time it's not going to be a big deal, but somebody might decide to come over.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's like I tell people, like, imagine like psychically, don't leave. You wouldn't go to sleep with your front door open, I hope. Right. I think we have to be thoughtful. Michael, what have I not asked you that I should have, or what have we not discussed that we should?
It's one thing that I heard on your last episode that I listened to that.
Thank you for listening.
It reminded me of a story. So you were talking, it was the clairaudience one. And you were talking about like hearing footsteps in the room above you. We did a case one time. It was in this old museum it's like an old mansion, but they turned it into a museum in Binghamton. And that was one of the reports, was they would hear footsteps in this room upstairs when they were in the living room. So we had recorders all over, and we were sitting down there in the living room, and we did hear what sounded like boot steps going above us, which, wasn't surprising because that was the report. But what was interesting is when we listened to all the recorders afterwards, we had a recorder in the room upstairs, and that didn't capture anything. But the one in the room where we were, you could hear the footsteps.
Which is crazy.
So I have a theory on that, and I don't quite know what the best words to describe it is, but my idea is that, like, what you're experiencing is sort of the memory of the room having the footsteps above, but the memory belongs to the room you're in. So there's not actually any footsteps going on upstairs. It's like, we talk a lot about residual energy, like just being a replay, but it's replaying in this room. It's not replaying upstairs. So if you get the recorders upstairs, you're not going to hear anything because it's not actually going on there.
That is so interesting. You're
Just
the
kind
first
of a crazy
person
thing
to mention that. I've never heard somebody kind of frame it like that, but now that you say that, it makes perfect sense.
Well, the only way you know is because you've got recorders all over, and like if there were actual boot step sounds in that room, they should be on the recorder, but there weren't.
Just wild.
The Angela's house, when we were at Angela's house, I heard footsteps too. That was one of her reports, footsteps in the hallway. And I was standing, leaning against the door frame in our dining room, and I heard the boot steps coming down the hall right behind me. I turned around, there's nobody in there.
Did you feel anything too, or is it completely an auditory kind of thing?
I didn't, because, I thought it was one of our team coming in. It was that clear. And I turned around to see who it was, and there's nobody there.
It's just wild, right? It really is. No, Kathy and I have had discussions about whether we should post any kind of phenomena that we capture. And Kathy's feeling is like it can just generate a lot of distracting kind of commentary about it's real, it's not real. And, you know, like you said, you're not going to convince people who are committed to believing it's not possible. You know, I'm kind of like, my inner 5-year-old's like, oh, post it. Like, oh, I want to hear it.
Yeah. There's always that temptation because you get something cool and you want to post it. But I kind of agree with her. Like, you'll just get the armchair skeptics picking it apart. The best piece of evidence I think that we ever caught, we never posted on our website anymore, partly because the client originally asked us not to, but also just because even after she said it's probably okay, there just wasn't that much point. It's not going to convince anybody.
Yeah. No, and I think it's so important that you respect that. A lot of people don't want their stuff out there. I'm always conflicted when I share my stuff, and it's like my podcast, and I'm like, oh, should I? But now it's out there, so it's too late.
Yep.
So, Michael, where can people find your book, The Rabbit Hole Experience on Sasquatches, Spirits, and the People Who See Them, your book with Paul Conroy?
Well, I guess you got to get it from Bezos like everybody else does because he sells everything.
Right.
So it is on Amazon. We've got, our website is still up. I don't update it all that much these days, but I still keep it. Every year when it comes up, I ask Paul if we should still keep it. And he says yes, because I'm paying for it. I have been posting some blog stuff out there. I even posted one about remote viewing at one point.
I read that one. I did. And I read the one about your father's experience with the time loop, too.
That's a weird story, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's up to you if you want to share it. Or do you want people to read it? You tell me what you prefer.
Yeah, let's make them read it.
You make them read it. You mentioned actually, it's Eric Wargo's book, right? On time loops as an explanation. And I think I've mentioned that in the retro causality episode. I'm no expert by any means, but I love that you were brave enough to share that personal anecdote, because it actually very clearly to me explained that whole time loop phenomenon. And it's a hard thing for people to wrap their minds around.
And it's something we take for granted in remote viewing. And I forget about that until like I'm talking to friends and I make some comment, a few friends that I talk to about these kinds of things. But I'll say something about, somebody did this and it polluted everybody's, sessions from last week. And then they just look at me stunned. I'm like, oh, I forgot you believe in linear time.
Well, it'll have to happen to them, but maybe they'll resolve their cognitive dissonance by just saying it didn't happen. I don't know.
Maybe. It's also a thing that happens in poltergeist cases too. This, like, when people will walk into another room and turn around and come back, and then all the furniture's rearranged in the room they just left. And that doesn't work in terms of time. That couldn't happen. Right?
No, not in linear time, but can I ask, have you actually had any cases where people have had that type of experience? To me, that's more rare than a haunting.
Can't remember one offhand where that was a claim. We had one where, I don't know if this would be quite the same thing, but we got to investigate the Naval Yard in Buffalo on 2 different occasions. They actually gave us the run of 2 battleships and a submarine for the night, which is the great thing about being a paranormal investigator. Like, people just give you the keys to things and walk away. And
I'm kind of shocked.
It's strange. Yeah. But one of the things that happened to us on the battleship was we went down and we went through this bunk room where all these bunks were hanging. And they were all intact. And then we came back a little while later, and one of them was broken off the chains and hanging. And we went and listened to the recorders and everything, and there's no noise of any kind. There's nothing to indicate that fell or anything. So I don't know what happened there.
And something that heavy, I don't even see how a regular person could do that on their own. You know what I mean? Like, there's no way you could do that silently.
No, I wouldn't think so.
No, that's crazy. That's crazy. Michael, your website is rabbitholeexperience.com.
That's right.
Okay, not the rabbit hole experience, but rabbitholeexperience.com.
Now you're testing. I think it's just rabbit hole experience. Yeah.
I think it is. I probably went there more recently than you did because you're a busy guy.
I'll bet somebody has the rabbit hole experience, though.
I'm sure they do. So you're not doing ghost investigations at this time?
Not actively. I mean, we're still available. Occasionally I'll get a call of somebody that read the book, or sometimes old clients will still get in touch with me.
Okay.
I have one woman that seems like about every 3 years or so, and it's usually around Halloween time, so it might be this year.
I hope the person does call you. It seems seasonally appropriate.
True. That's what worries me.
But if people have a haunting or something they want somebody to, consider investigating, they can reach out. There is a whole Atlantic Paranormal Society network.
Taps Family,
Yeah.
I believe is still running.
Okay.
Last I knew, I heard that the Ghost Hunters still had a show too. Is that true?
I think so. I know there's all these different offshoots,
Right.
and definitely some YouTube stuff as well.
Yeah, I know they closed the original show, but I think there's still something going on.
Yeah. Well, your book is really interesting. You've got such an interesting take on it. I love that it's conversational. I think it's a very relatable read.
Yeah.
And, you take subjects that could be frightening for people. And you kind of, I don't know if the word is humanize them, but you make them approachable. And I think that in and of itself is comforting for people.
Well, that's what we're hoping, that people can read it, sort of see maybe something that they're experiencing in it, and maybe feel better. That's always been our goal for any investigation, is when we leave, the people feel more comfortable and can go on with their lives.
Well,
whether we have explanations or not.
Oh, that's great. And that's kind of what people need, right? Who doesn't need to feel more comfortable in a situation like that? Michael, thank you so much for making the time to meet with me tonight. Again, I know you're a very busy man, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I hope you have an amazing Halloween.
You too.
Free from calls.
Put the phone on Do Not Disturb.
Yeah. I will put the book information and your website in the show notes.
Thank you, Traci. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. This has been another episode of Curious Explorers. If you like the episode, and I know you do, please remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment. Tell us what you think. Sharing experiences you've had. And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
I know that the paranormal is real. Listen.